It's the fall of 1957. America is nervous. The Soviets just launched Sputnik. The economy is sliding into a recession that will be one of the sharpest of the post-war era. And in Detroit, the men who run the largest car companies on Earth are staring at a problem. How do you sell speed, power, and optimism to a country that suddenly feels neither rich nor safe? The answer they come up with is 1958, a model year that history has almost forgotten, sandwiched between the chrome excess of the mid-1950s and the muscle car explosion of the 1960s. But underestimate 1958 at your own risk. This was a year Detroit quietly built some of the fastest, most technically radical cars it had ever produced. Fuel-injected engines, factory superchargers, triple carburetors, horsepower numbers that seemed impossible for a family sedan. In the next 45 minutes, we're going to tell the story of the fastest American cars of 1958, the machines that raced at Daytona, the executives who bet their careers on them, and the surprising ways this single, overlooked year reshaped everything Detroit would build for the next 2 decades. To understand why 1958's cars were built the way they were, you have to understand the year itself. The United States was in the grip of what economists still call the Eisenhower recession. Industrial production had dropped sharply, unemployment was climbing towards 7.5%, and consumer confidence had taken a real hit. For an industry that had spent the entire decade selling bigger, longer, and more chrome-laden cars every single year, this was uncharted territory. At the same time, the Cold War was reaching a new pitch of anxiety. Sputnik had gone up in October 1957, and suddenly the average American was looking at the night sky and wondering if the Soviets were ahead in science, in engineering, in everything. Detroit's answer, strange as it sounds, was to lean into technology as reassurance. If a Soviet satellite could orbit the Earth, an American car could still out-accelerate anything on the road. Horsepower became a kind of patriotic statement. This is the paradox that defines 1958. A recession year, an Edsel launch year, a year when overall sales cratered, and yet also the year that Chrysler, Pontiac, Studebaker Packard, and Ford all pushed engineering further than they ever had before. Fuel injection appeared on regular production cars. Superchargers came standard from the factory. Horsepower wars that had been simmering since the early 50s boiled over completely. Detroit wasn't just building cars in 1958. It was trying to outrun a bad economy, a scared public, and a country that had just been reminded it wasn't the only technological superpower on the planet. By 1958, Detroit's power structure looked like this. General Motors dominated with roughly 45% of the American market spread across 5 divisions: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. Ford Motor Company was the clear number 2 and had just made the boldest and most expensive gamble in its history by launching an entirely new brand, Edsel. Chrysler Corporation sat in 3rd place, but its engineering department was arguably the most aggressive in the business. And then there was American Motors and Studebaker Packard, smaller companies fighting for survival, which ironically is exactly what pushed them towards some of the most daring engineering of the year. Each company approached the speed problem differently. GM had the resources to brute force horsepower through bigger engines and multiple carburetors. Chrysler bet on a new generation of high-compression V8s combined with Ram-tuned intake manifolds. Ford, still smarting from years of playing it safe, decided 1958 was the year to reinvent the Thunderbird entirely. And Studebaker Packard, with almost no budget left, did something remarkable. They turned to a supercharger, forced induction, to squeeze big engine power out of a small engine car. This wasn't a coordinated effort. It was 5 or 6 competing philosophies, all converging on the same conclusion at the same time. In a recession, speed sells hope, and in 1958, Detroit sold a lot of it. If one single car defines 1958, it's arguably the Chevrolet Impala, and this is its debut year. Not yet the icon it would become in the 1960s, but already a signal of where Chevrolet was headed. Introduced as the top trim of the Bel Air line, the Impala came with distinctive triple taillights, a wider rear stance, and crucially, access to Chevrolet's 348 cubic inch W Series big block V8, a genuinely new engine architecture for the brand. With the optional tri-power setup, three two-barrel carburetors feeding that 348, the Impala could be ordered with up to 315 horsepower, a startling number for a Chevrolet passenger car at the time. This wasn't the small block that had powered Chevy since 1955. This was a heavier, torquier engine explicitly designed to compete with Detroit's biggest performers. What makes the Impala's story so important isn't just the horsepower figure. It's what the car represented strategically. Chevrolet had built its reputation on being the affordable, sensible choice. The Impala and its 348 big block option told the market something different, that even Chevrolet's mainstream buyers wanted and could get genuine performance. It was a preview of the entire muscle car philosophy that would define the 1960s. Take a popular, affordable body, drop in a genuinely powerful engine, and let buyers self-select into performance. The 1958 Impala wasn't the fastest car of the year, but it was arguably the most consequential because it proved that performance and mass market appeal didn't have to be separate categories. Pontiac in the mid-1950s had a reputation problem. It was seen as an old man's car, solid but unexciting. General Manager Semen Bunky Knutson, who took over the division in 1956, had one clear mission: make Pontiac fast, and make it feel fast. The 1958 Bonneville was the clearest statement of that mission yet. The Bonneville came equipped with Pontiac's 370 cubic inch V8, and with the tri-power carburetor setup, output reached as high as 310 horsepower. Some sources cite figures approaching 330 with the right combination of options. Just as important as the raw numbers was the way Pontiac marketed the car: aggressive styling, wide chrome-trimmed silver streak hood accents, and, for the first time widely available, fuel injection was also on Pontiac's options sheet for a short window, though it saw limited uptake compared to the carbureted tri-power engines. The Bonneville's real legacy is strategic. This was the beginning of Pontiac's transformation from a stodgy family brand into the performance division that would give America the GTO just 6 years later. Knudsen understood something that a lot of Detroit executives were only beginning to grasp: that horsepower numbers could be sold as an identity, not just a specification. The 1958 Bonneville was Pontiac telling the country, unmistakably, "We are the fast one now." If you were racing in 1958 and money was no object, the car to beat was a Chrysler 300D. Widely regarded as the fastest full-production American car of the year, and arguably the fastest four-seat car in the world at the time. The numbers were staggering for the era. The 300D's 392 cubic inch HEMI V8, equipped with dual 4-barrel carburetors, was factory rated at 380 horsepower. And with the optional Bendix electronic fuel injection system, some 300Ds were rated even higher, though the fuel-injected units proved troublesome and most were later converted back to carburetors. Even in standard carbureted form, the 300D could reportedly reach top speeds well over 140 miles per hour, and it dominated NASCAR's flying mile speed trials at Daytona Beats that February, with a top recorded speed widely cited around 156 miles per hour for a modified stock entry. What set the Letter Series 300 apart wasn't just power, it was the philosophy behind it. Chrysler engineer Robert Roger had created the original 300 in 1955 specifically as an image car: expensive, low production, built to win with none of the compromises of a mainstream family sedan. By 1958, that formula had matured into the 300D, a car that combined genuine luxury appointments: leather interior, push-button TorqueFlite automatic transmission, power everything, with a drivetrain that could outrun almost anything else on American roads. This mattered because it established a template Detroit would reuse for the next 15 years, the idea of a banker's hot rod, a car respectable enough to be driven to church on Sunday and brutal enough to win a stoplight drag on Monday. The Chrysler 300 letter series, and the 300D specifically, is arguably the direct ancestor of the entire American performance luxury category. Not every fast car of 1958 came from a company with deep pockets. Studebaker Packard was, by this point, a company fighting for its life. Sales were collapsing, and there was no budget for a new engine program. So Studebaker's engineers did something clever instead. They took the company's existing 289 cubic inch V8, which on its own produced modest power, and bolted on a McCulloch centrifugal supercharger. The result was the Golden Hawk, and specifically its supercharged variant, which produced around 275 horsepower, a huge jump for an engine that size, and enough to make the Golden Hawk one of the quickest accelerating American cars of the year, despite Studebaker's tiny budget. Contemporary road tests recorded 0 to 60 times in the neighborhood of 8 seconds, genuinely competitive with cars from companies many times Studebaker's size. The Golden Hawk story is really a story about engineering under constraint. Studebaker couldn't outspend General Motors or Chrysler on displacement, so it out-engineered them on efficiency, using forced induction to get big engine performance from a small engine platform. It's a strategy that would look remarkably familiar decades later, when fuel crises and emissions rules forced the entire industry to embrace turbocharging and supercharging as a way to make smaller engines perform like bigger ones. In that sense, the humble, struggling Studebaker Golden Hawk was ahead of its time in a way its more famous competitors weren't. While the Chrysler 300D chased headlines, its corporate sibling Plymouth was proving that Chrysler's engineering talent didn't stop at the luxury tier. The 1958 Plymouth Fury, soon to become a cultural touchstone thanks to a certain 1983 Stephen King novel and film, came standard with a 318 cubic inch V8, but the real story was the optional 350 cubic inch engine, which with dual 4-barrel carburetors could be ordered producing around 305 horsepower. That made the Fury one of the quickest full-size cars available at anything close to its price point. Plymouth marketed it aggressively as a performance flagship, gold anodized trim, distinctive styling, and a drivetrain punching well above its weight class. Where the Chrysler 300 sold exclusivity, the Fury sold accessible performance, letting a middle-class buyer put a genuinely fast car in their driveway without imperial-level money. This dual strategy, a halo car at the top of the lineup and a junior performance model reaching further down the price ladder, is a blueprint Chrysler, and eventually all of Detroit, would return to again and again through the muscle car era. The 1958 Fury is one of its earliest and clearest examples. Sitting between Plymouth and Chrysler in the corporate lineup, Dodge also had a genuine speed contender in 1958, and it's one of the most overlooked cars of the entire era. The D500 option package, available across several Dodge body styles, including the Coronet and Custom Royal. The D500 package brought a 361 cubic inch V8 with dual 4-barrel carburetors, producing output commonly cited around 320 horsepower. Genuinely competitive with anything Pontiac or Chevrolet were offering that year, and closer to Chrysler 300 territory than most buyers realized. Because Dodge marketed the D500 quietly as an option rather than a distinct model identity, the way Chrysler did with the 300 series, it never achieved the same fame. But mechanically, it was every bit as serious, a genuine high-performance engine buried inside an otherwise ordinary-looking Dodge sedan. The D500's obscurity today is almost a lesson in itself. 1958 produced so many genuinely fast American cars that some of the fastest ones simply got lost in the crowd. Marketing, not engineering, often determined which cars became legends and which became footnotes. Ford took a completely different path to relevance in 1958. Rather than chasing the biggest horsepower number, Ford reinvented its signature performance car entirely. The two-seat Thunderbird, which had never sold in huge numbers despite its iconic status, was redesigned for 1958 as a four-seat Squarebird, with a unibody structure and the new 352 cubic inch V8 producing around 300 horsepower, with a higher output 300-plus horsepower version available as well. This was a controversial decision at the time. Purists hated losing the two-seat format, but commercially, it was one of the smartest calls Ford made all decade. Four-seat Thunderbird sales roughly tripled compared to the outgoing two-seater, proving that there was a much bigger market for a fast, stylish, personal luxury car than there ever was for a pure two-seat sports car. The 1958 Thunderbird effectively invented the personal luxury car segment that would dominate American showrooms for the next 2 decades. Cars like the Buick Riviera, the Oldsmobile Tornado, and eventually the entire personal luxury coupe category of the 1970s all trace their DNA back to this decision. Ford didn't just build a fast car in 1958, it built the prototype for an entire genre of American automobile. No account of Detroit in 1958 is complete without the Edsel, and it belongs in this story precisely because it shows the limits of what horsepower could fix. Ford launched the Edsel brand in September 1957 with enormous fanfare and a genuinely potent engine lineup, including a 410 cubic inch V8 in top trims, producing around 345 horsepower, among the largest engines in the entire industry that year. But the Edsel arrived at exactly the wrong moment, right as a recession hit, right as buyers were pulling back from expensive new models, and its styling, particularly the vertical horse-collar grille, drew widespread ridicule. No amount of horsepower could overcome a launch this badly timed and a design this polarizing. Edsel sales collapsed almost immediately, and the brand would be discontinued entirely by 1960, becoming one of the most famous business failures in American corporate history. The Edsel's lesson for Detroit was blunt. In 1958, speed and power were necessary to compete, but they were not sufficient. Timing, styling, and public trust mattered just as much as what was under the hood, a lesson the entire industry would take seriously for the next decade. At the very top of the market, Cadillac wasn't interested in horsepower wars for their own sake, but the 1958 Eldorado Brougham proved that Detroit's most expensive car could also be genuinely quick. Hand-built with a stainless steel roof, quad headlights, and an astonishing list of firsts, air suspension, a memory seat, an automatic trunk release, the Brougham carried Cadillac's 365 cubic inch V8, producing around 335 horsepower. Priced at roughly $13,074, nearly 3 times the cost of a standard Cadillac, and close to the price of a Rolls-Royce, the Eldorado Brougham was never about winning stoplight races. It was about proving that Detroit's engineering could rival anything Europe produced, in both refinement and outright pace. Cadillac built fewer than 500 of them in 1958, at a significant financial loss on every single unit, a deliberate halo project meant to demonstrate technical supremacy rather than turn a profit. The Eldorado Brougham matters to this story because it shows that fast in 1958 didn't only mean drag strips and NASCAR ovals. It also meant proving that American luxury cars could match European performance and engineering sophistication point for point, a competitive front that would only intensify over the following decades. Oldsmobile and Buick, GM's two mid-tier luxury brands, weren't going to set out the horsepower race either. The 1958 Oldsmobile 98 came with a 371 cubic inch V8 producing up to 305 horsepower with the triple carburetor J2 option, while Buick's Limited Series carried a 364 cubic inch V8 rated around 300 horsepower. Neither car was chasing outright speed records the way Chrysler or Pontiac were. Instead, they represent something equally important to this story: how thoroughly the performance mindset had spread across the entire industry by 1958. It wasn't just the sporty brands or the halo models anymore. Full-size family sedans and comfortable highway cruisers from GM's mid-range divisions were all quietly putting out 300-plus horsepower as a matter of course. The horsepower war of 1958 wasn't confined to a few flagship models. It had become the baseline expectation across nearly every price tier in the American car market. All these horsepower claims needed to be proven somewhere, and in 1958, that meant Daytona Beach, Florida, where NASCAR Speed Week still ran on the hard-packed sand of the actual beach before the purpose-built Super Speedway opened the following year. Manufacturers sent factory-prepared cars to compete in the flying mile trials, and the results made headlines across the country. The Chrysler 300D dominated, posting speeds that made it the fastest American production car verified that year. Pontiac and Ford entries also posted strong numbers, and the results were used directly in advertising, as Proven at Daytona became a genuine selling point on showroom brochures. NASCAR's stock car circuit itself was also becoming a critical proving ground. Wins on Sunday translated directly into sales on Monday, a phrase that was already becoming gospel inside Detroit's marketing departments by 1958. This connection between competitive racing and consumer sales cemented something that would define American car culture for decades. The idea that a car's legitimacy as fast needed to be proven in public, under controlled and competitive conditions, not just claimed in a brochure. The 1958 racing season, modest as it looks in hindsight compared to what NASCAR would become, was where Detroit learned that lesson in earnest. So what did all of this actually change? Several things, and they compounded over the following decade. First, 1958 normalized the big block V8 as a mainstream option, not an exotic one. Engines like Chevrolet's 348, Chrysler's 383 and 392, and Pontiac's 370 proved there was real demand for genuine displacement even in a recession year, setting up the even larger big blocks of the 1960s. Second, 1958 proved that multiple carburation, tri-power, dual-quad setups could be sold as a mainstream option rather than a race-only modification. This directly paved the way for the option sheets of the mid-1960s muscle car era, where triple two barrels and dual four barrels became legendary factory choices on cars like the GTO and the Roadrunner. Third, the early and imperfect experiments with electronic fuel injection on the Chrysler 300D and the Pontiac Bonneville, both of which struggled with reliability and were largely abandoned within a couple of years, taught Detroit's engineers hard lessons about the limits of the technology available at the time, lessons that would inform far more successful fuel injection systems decades later. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, 1958 proved the market segmentation strategy that would define the 1960s. A halo performance car at the top of a lineup, the Chrysler 300, the Thunderbird, paired with more accessible performance trims further down the price ladder, the Fury, the D500, the Impala. This trickle-down performance model became the standard playbook for every major manufacturer by the time the true muscle car era began, around 1964. In other words, 1958 wasn't the detour from Detroit's story, it was a rehearsal for everything that came next. History remembers 1958 mostly for the Etzel's failure and for the recession that briefly stalled the entire American auto industry. But underneath that story is a quieter, more remarkable one, a single model year in which Chevrolet, Pontiac, Chrysler, Dodge, Plymouth, Ford, Studebaker, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, and Buick all simultaneously pushed the boundaries of horsepower, forced induction, fuel injection, and performance marketing during the worst economic conditions the industry had faced since the Great Depression. That combination of pressure and ambition is exactly what makes 1958 worth remembering. The Chrysler 300D's speed records, the Impala's debut, the Bonneville's identity shift, the Golden Hawk's clever supercharging, the Thunderbird's reinvention. These weren't isolated stories, they were pieces of a single industry-wide bet that even in hard times, Americans would pay for speed, for power, and for the feeling of moving forward. 6 years later, that bet paid off completely when the Pontiac GTO kicked off the true muscle car era. But the blueprint for that explosion, the engines, the marketing, the racing credibility, the segmentation strategy, was drawn up in 1958, in a recession year, by engineers and executives who refused to slow down. That's the real story of the fastest American cars of 1958, not just machines that were quick in a straight line, but a turning point that quietly set the direction for everything Detroit would build for the next 20 years. If you enjoyed this deep dive into 1958's forgotten performance war, let us know in the comments which of these cars you'd want in your own garage, and subscribe for more overlooked chapters of American automotive history.